The invitation. The diplomatic station known as a cord spire hung in the cold dark like a ring of frozen light, spinning slowly around a pulsar that pulsed once every 4 seconds, like the heartbeat of something ancient and indifferent. Ambassador Rael Vasquez stood at the viewport of the ESS Olive Branch and watched the station grow larger as her ship approached on a gentle arc. The kind of approach that said, "We come slowly, and we come in peace, and we have nothing to hide." She had practiced that approach the same way she had practiced her smile and her handshake, and the way she tilted her head when she listened to someone speak. Because Rael understood something that most diplomats in the galaxy did not. That every single thing you do in a room full of strangers is a message, whether you mean it to be or not. Behind her, the bridge crew worked quietly at their stations, and beside her stood Captain David Okafor, who had not spoken in over an hour. Unusual for him, because David could go entire days without saying anything that was not absolutely necessary. He was tall and broad, and there was a scar that ran from his left ear down to his jaw, and his official title was Cultural Liaison, which was the kind of title that meant almost nothing and hid almost everything. Rael glanced at him and said, "How do I look?" And David looked at her for a moment and said, "Like someone who brought a gift basket to a sentencing hearing." And Rael laughed, because that was almost exactly what she had done. In the cargo bay below them, there were crates filled with bottles of wine from vineyards in Argentina and France, and small sculptures carved by artists in Lagos and Kyoto, and hand-drawn pictures from children in schools across Earth, pictures of stars and alien faces and stick figures holding hands beneath suns that were not the sun, each one carrying a message that said, "We hope you are friendly out there." That humanity was bringing to the most powerful governing body in the known galaxy. The Conclave of 12 had existed for longer than humans had possessed fire, and it was made up of the 12 oldest and most powerful species in the galaxy, each one commanding fleets and economies and territories that made the entire human civilization look like a small town at the edge of a great and endless city. Humanity had been in space for only 140 years, which in galactic terms was barely a blink, and in those years they had spread to a few dozen systems and built colonies and trade routes and a modest fleet that the Conclave regarded the way a mountain might regard a pebble, if mountains could regard things at all. The reason for this gathering was simple. 12 systems rich in rare minerals and energy resources had been colonized by humanity over the past 60 years, and the Valith Dominion, an ancient insectoid empire with a hive-based civilization and a very long memory, had declared that those systems had been promised to them by Conclave Charter 3 centuries before humans had even left their own atmosphere. The Valith wanted the systems back, and the Conclave had called humanity here to make that happen. Not to negotiate, to be told. The olive branch docked with a soft clang that echoed through the hull, and Rael straightened her jacket and picked up a leather bag that contained a bottle of Malbec and a drawing from a 7-year-old girl named Sophia, who had drawn a picture of a human and an alien sharing a plate of cookies beneath a sky full of stars, and had written underneath it, in crooked letters, "Please be nice to each other." Rael carried that drawing with her everywhere. The delegation walked through the docking corridor and into the Accord Spire, and the station was enormous and beautiful in a way that made Rael feel very small, which she suspected was the point, because everything about this place was designed to remind you that you were in the presence of powers far older and far greater than yourself. The negotiation chamber was a vast circular room with seats arranged in descending tiers like an amphitheater, and at the center was a long curved table where the delegations would sit face to face, and above them floated holographic displays showing star maps and legal documents in a dozen languages. The other delegations were already present, and Rael could feel their eyes on her as she entered, dozens of alien species, each one watching the humans with expressions that ranged from curiosity to pity, to open contempt. She smiled at every single one of them. She handed out gifts and made small talk, and complimented the Dravosi delegate on the color of his ceremonial armor, and asked the Nathari representative about her children, because Rael had done her research, and she knew that Nathari valued family above almost everything else. Warmth with confusion, and some with amusement, and some simply stared at her, as though she were a small animal that had wandered into a room full of predators, and did not yet understand where it was. At the head of the chamber, Arbiter Tolsharon rose to open the proceedings, and the Arbiter was a being made of living crystal, tall and angular and ancient beyond human comprehension. And when he spoke, his voice rang through the room like a bell struck once in a cathedral. He laid out the terms with the calm authority of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. Humanity would withdraw from the 12 disputed systems within one standard cycle. Humanity would pay reparations to the Valith Dominion for the resources already extracted. Humanity would accept Valith oversight of all future expansion efforts, and humanity would formally acknowledge the primacy of Conclave Charter over its own territorial claims. These were not suggestions, and they were not the opening position of a negotiation. They were instructions. P. The chamber was quiet when the Arbiter finished, and every delegation watched the human ambassador, the way you might watch a glass of water that someone had placed too close to the edge of a table, waiting for it to fall. Rael listened to every word, and she did not flinch, and she did not frown. And when the Arbiter was finished, she stood and thanked him with a warmth that seemed so genuine that several delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, because they could not understand how someone could be told to surrender everything and respond with gratitude. Then she said in a voice that carried clearly to every corner of that enormous room, "We appreciate the proposal, and we understand the position of the conclave, and we would like to present a counteroffer." The silence that followed was not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the sharp silence of surprise, because minor species did not counteroffer the conclave. That was simply not something that happened in this room. Rael reached into her bag and pulled out a datapad and slid it across the table toward the Arbiter, and on it were humanity's territorial claims, supported by economic projections and legal arguments and mutual defense proposals and trade agreements that would benefit not just humanity, but a dozen other species in the room. And at the very bottom of the document, in small, clean text, was a single line that read, "Humanity desires peace. Humanity is also prepared for the alternative." The Arbiter looked at the datapad, and then looked at Rael, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not know what to say. Rael sat back down and folded her hands, and smiled, and waited. And somewhere deep in the belly of the olive branch, in a room that did not appear on any official schematic, Captain David Okafor watched a console that showed the positions of things that were very far away, and very quiet, and very patient. And he whispered to no one in particular, "Easy now, not yet." H1. Cracks in the table. By the second day of negotiations, the Valith delegation had begun to understand that something was wrong, because the humans were not behaving the way they were supposed to behave. Hive Commander Zareth stood at the head of his delegation like a tower of black chitin and compound eyes and mandibles that clicked when he was angry, which at this point was almost always, because Ambassador Rael Vasquez had just spent 3 hours dismantling his legal claim to the disputed systems, using the Conclave's own laws. She had quoted statutes that were older than human civilization, and she had found loopholes in treaties that the Valith themselves had written, and she had done all of it with the calm, steady patience of someone who had been preparing for this conversation for a very long time. Zareth had expected fear, and instead he had gotten footnotes. He had expected surrender, and instead he had gotten a woman who smiled at him and said things like, "I understand your position completely, and I think we can find middle ground that respects the spirit of the original charter, while acknowledging the practical reality of existing settlements. And somehow, that was worse than any threat, because it meant she was not afraid. And a creature that was not afraid was a creature that either did not understand the danger, or understood it better than you did. On the third day the negotiations continued, and Rael brought pastries from the Olive Branch's kitchen, and offered them to every delegation, and the Nethari representative, whose name was Syl, took one and ate it, and found that it was quite good, which annoyed her, because she did not want to like anything about these humans. Syl was not just a diplomat, she was an intelligence operative, and the Nethari were known across the galaxy as the finest information brokers and spies that had ever existed, and Syl had been watching the humans very carefully since they arrived. Something about them did not add up. It started with small things. The way Captain David Okafor moved through the station like a man who had already memorized every corridor and exit. The way the human security team positioned themselves at junctions that just happened to be the most tactically important points on the station. The way the Olive Branch had docked in a berth that gave it a clear departure vector to open space, even though that berth was further from the negotiation chamber, and less convenient in every other way. These were not the habits of diplomats. These were the habits of soldiers. On the fourth night, Syl could not sleep, and so she did what she always did when she could not sleep. She went looking for secrets. She accessed the Nethari intelligence network and began pulling every file that existed on human military capability. And what she found was ordinary and small, and exactly what everyone expected. A few hundred warships, a modest defense budget, shipyards that produced vessels at a rate consistent with a minor spacefaring civilization. But then, she started looking at what was not there. There were gaps, shipyards listed in construction permits that never appeared in fleet registries, research stations in deep space that broadcast on frequencies no one had ever cracked, cargo routes that moved through systems with no colonies and no resources and no reason for anyone to go there, unless they had reasons they did not want anyone to know about. She found personnel records that listed thousands of engineers and scientists assigned to projects with names that meant nothing, and locations that did not exist on any public map. And she found energy consumption reports from human industrial stations that showed power usage far beyond what their official operations could possibly require. And she found one more thing that made the fur on the back of her neck stand up. A pattern in human fleet movements over the past 20 years that looked random if you glanced at it, but looked very much like a slow, deliberate positioning if you studied it long enough. She brought her findings to Arbiter Tol Sharon in a private meeting, and the Arbiter listened, and then dismissed her concerns with the gentle condescension of someone who had seen 1,000 minor species come and go, and he said, "They are young, and they are frightened, and young, frightened species sometimes play at being larger than they are. It means nothing." Syl left that meeting unconvinced. Meanwhile, in his quarters aboard the Valith flagship, Zareth was making plans of his own, because he had decided that negotiation was a waste of time, and that what was needed was a reminder of the natural order of things. He contacted his fleet masters through a secure channel, and ordered a war fleet to be assembled and sent to the Accord Spire. 400 warships, each one a hive carrier capable of deploying thousands of drone fighters, each one a cathedral of chitin and metal and fury. They would arrive within 2 days, and when they did, the humans would see what real power looked like, and they would stop quoting statutes and start packing their bags. On the 5th day, Rael was in her quarters reviewing trade proposals, when David entered without knocking, which meant it was important. He said, "The Valith have a fleet incoming, 400 ships, heavy combat configuration, estimated arrival in 36 hours. Rael did not look up from her datapad for a long moment, and when she did, her expression was not frightened or surprised, but tired, in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. It was the tiredness of someone who had hoped for the best and planned for the worst, and was now watching the worst begin to unfold. She asked, "How sure are we?" And David said, "Completely." And she nodded and set down her datapad and said, "Then move to phase 2. Ask if she was sure, because he had known Rael for 15 years, and he had never once seen her give an order she had not thought about from every angle. And so he simply nodded and left. He went to the hidden room deep in the olive branch, and sat down at his console, and composed a transmission that was exactly 3 words long, and encrypted in a cipher that used a key based on a mathematical principle that human cryptographers had never published, and never shared, and never even hinted at in any academic paper. He sent the transmission, and it went out into the dark. But it did not go to Earth. It went everywhere, to dozens of points scattered across the galaxy, in systems that had no human colonies, and no human stations, and no human presence of any kind, according to every record that every species had ever kept. Syl intercepted the transmission 17 minutes later, because Syl intercepted almost everything, and she could not crack the encryption, which was expected, but she could trace the signal path, which she did, and what she found made her sit very still for a very long time. The transmission had reached 47 separate locations, spread across the galaxy, and at each location there was nothing, no station, no ship, no beacon, no signal, nothing at all, according to every sensor and every database and every map. But the transmission had reached something at each of those points, because something had received it, and something had acknowledged it, and each acknowledgement was a single pulse, so brief and so faint that you would miss it entirely if you were not specifically looking for it. 47 ghost signals from 47 empty points in space. Syl sat in her quarters and stared at her screen, and felt something she had not felt in a career that spanned decades of navigating the most dangerous secrets in the galaxy. She felt afraid. Not the small sharp fear of immediate danger, but the deep, slow fear of realizing that the thing you thought you understood was something else entirely, and that you had been looking at it wrong the whole time. She whispered to herself, "What are you?" And out in the dark, 47 points of nothing waited in perfect silence for whatever came next. The Violet War Fleet arrived on the morning of the 6th day, and it came out of faster-than-light travel, like a swarm of black hornets pouring out of a nest. 400 warships, each one bristling with weapons and drone bays, and the cold promise of violence. The Accord Spire shuddered as the gravitational wash of that many ships dropping out of light speed rolled across the station, and alarms began to sound, and minor delegations began to scramble for their ships, because when 400 Violet Hive carriers showed up somewhere, it usually meant that something was about to die. In the negotiation chamber, the holographic displays flickered and filled with red icons as the station's sensors cataloged the incoming fleet, and the numbers were staggering. Enough firepower to reduce a small planet to rubble, enough drone fighters to darken the sky of any world they descended upon. The delegations murmured and shifted, and several ambassadors rose from their seats and made for the exits, because they had not signed up for a war, and they could see one coming. Arbiter Tolsharan stood at the head of the chamber, and his crystalline body rang with a low tone that meant distress, and he called for order, but his voice lacked the certainty it had carried on the first day, because even he had not expected the Valeth to go this far. Hive Commander Zareth entered the chamber flanked by 8 armored soldiers, each one standing 7 feet tall and carrying weapons that hummed with charged energy. And he walked to the center of the room and looked down at Rael Vasquez, who was still seated at the table with her hands folded and a cup of coffee growing cold beside her. Zareth spoke, and his voice was a deep vibration that you felt in your chest as much as you heard with your ears. And he said, "The time for games is over. Humanity will accept the original terms immediately and completely, or the Valeth Dominion will secure the disputed systems by force, and the Conclave will recognize our right to do so." He looked around the room as he said this, and none of the conclave species objected, because the Valith were too powerful and too old and too important to challenge. And besides, this was only about putting a minor species back in its place, and minor species were put back in their places all the time. Every eye in the chamber turned to Rael. This was the moment she was supposed to break. The moment the weight of 400 warships and the indifference of every great power in the galaxy was supposed to crush the hope out of her, and leave nothing behind but compliance. Rael looked at Zareth for a long, quiet moment, and then she stood, and she did not stand quickly or dramatically, but slowly and deliberately, the way someone stands when they have made a decision they have been thinking about for a very long time. She straightened her jacket, and she looked not at Zareth, but at the full conclave assembled above her in their tiered seats, and she began to speak. She said, "I want to tell you about my species." She said, "We are young. You know this, and you remind us of it often. And you are right. We have been among the stars for less than 2 centuries. And in that time, we have done our best to learn and to listen, and to be good neighbors in a galaxy that was here long before us." She said, "But before we came to the stars, we spent a very long time alone on a single world. And in that time, we did terrible things to each other. We fought wars that killed millions. And we built weapons that could end all life on our planet. And we came so close to destroying ourselves that the margin between survival and extinction was thinner than most of you would believe." She said, "We carry that history with us everywhere we go, and it has taught us 2 things. The first is that peace is the most precious thing in the universe, and that it must always be the first thing we reach for and the last thing we let go of." She paused, and the chamber was silent, and even Zareth's mandibles had stopped clicking. She said, "The second thing it taught us is that peace is not the same as surrender, and that there is a difference between choosing not to fight and being unable to fight, and that any species that confuses the two has made a mistake that our history books are full of." She looked at Zareth directly, and her eyes were not angry and not frightened, but steady and clear and sad in a way that made several delegates look away, because there was something in that sadness that felt like a warning. She said, "We came here to talk peace. We meant it then and we mean it now. But we have never, not once in our entire history, gone quietly." Then she nodded to Captain David Okafor, who had been standing at the edge of the chamber like a shadow, and David stepped forward and touched a control on his wrist, and the holographic displays above the chamber activated. Table changed. The star map zoomed out, and the Valith fleet appeared as a cluster of red icons surrounding the Accord spire. And for a moment, that was all there was. 400 red dots, and 1 small blue dot that was the olive branch. And then the blue dots began to appear. They came in from the edges of the display, like stars winking into existence, 1 by 1, and then 10 by 10, and then 100 by 100, and each one was a human warship decloaking from systems and positions where no human presence had ever been detected. They came from behind asteroid fields, and out of the shadows of gas giants, and from the deep black between stars where nothing was supposed to be, and they kept coming and coming and coming, until the holographic display was so full of blue icons that the Valith fleet looked like a small red stain in an ocean of cold blue light. The room watched in silence as the count climbed. 500, 1,000, 2,000, 3,000. Dreadnoughts, the size of Valith hive carriers, and heavy cruisers, and destroyer screens and carrier groups, and weapons platforms, and ships of designs that no species in the galaxy had ever seen before. They had been there for weeks, positioned silently in the dark, long before the talks had even begun, running on minimal power, with their drives cold, and their weapons dormant, and their crews waiting in the quiet patience that humans had learned from 10,000 years of hunting and being hunted. And then the olive branch itself changed. The modest civilian plating that had covered its hull began to retract and fold away like a chrysalis splitting open, and what emerged from underneath was not a diplomatic cruiser, but a command battleship, a thing of layered armor and weapon arrays and sensor towers and power signatures that made the Valith flagship look like a fishing boat next to an aircraft carrier. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted and rose from their seats, and Zareth's soldiers raised their weapons, and Zareth himself took a step backward, which was something a Valith hive commander had not done in the presence of a lesser species in living memory. Arbiter Tolsharen's crystalline body was ringing with a high, sharp tone that filled the room like a struck tuning fork, and his voice, when he finally spoke, was stripped of all its ancient composure as he demanded to know what was happening. Rael stood in the center of it all, and she had not moved, and she had not raised her voice, and the sadness in her eyes had not gone away, because she had hoped, truly and deeply hoped, that none of this would be necessary. She looked at Zareth, who was staring at the holographic display with his compound eyes wide and his mandibles frozen, and she said in a voice that was calm and clear and carried to every corner of that vast chamber, "We came here to talk peace, Hive Commander, and we meant that sincerely, but you should know that we have never in our entire history walked into a room we could not walk out of." The chamber fell silent. 3,000 human warships hung in the dark outside the station, their weapons cold but ready, their crews at their stations, their presence a statement that did not need words. And in that silence, every species in the galaxy that had looked at humanity and seen something small and young and harmless began to understand that they had been wrong. Not about the peace. The humans had meant every word of that, but about the harmless part, the weight of the gun. In the hours that followed the reveal, the Accord Spire became a place balanced on the edge of a knife, and everyone inside it could feel the blade. The Valith war fleet of 400 ships now sat inside a sphere of 3,000 human warships, and the math of that situation was so simple and so brutal that even species who had never fought a war in their existence understood it immediately. The Valith were surrounded and outgunned, and if shooting started, it would not be a battle, but an execution. Hive Commander Zareth stormed through the corridors of the station, with his soldiers flanking him, and his mandibles clicking so fast and so hard that the sound was like a machine running out of control. He demanded an emergency session of the full conclave, and he demanded that humanity's actions be declared an act of war, and he demanded that every species with a fleet in range be summoned to defend the sovereignty of the conclave against human aggression. Arbiter Tolsharen listened to all of this, and for the first time in his ancient life, he found himself unable to give a clear answer, because technically, and the Arbiter was a being who lived and breathed technicality, no human weapon had been fired, and no human ship had crossed into Valith space, and no treaty had been violated. The human fleet was in neutral space, and it had been in neutral space the entire time. And while it was certainly alarming and certainly unprecedented, there was no law in the Conclave Charter that said a species could not bring its military to a neutral zone. Zareth pointed out that the humans had hidden their fleet, and the Arbiter pointed out that the Valith had openly brought a war fleet to intimidate a negotiating partner, and that neither action was technically prohibited, and that perhaps both sides had been less than forthcoming about their intentions. Zareth did not take this well. While Zareth raged through the halls of the Accord Spire, a very different kind of investigation was happening in the quarters of Syl, the Nathari intelligence operative who had not slept in 2 days and who was now surrounded by holographic screens filled with data that she had pulled from every source she could access. She was trying to understand the true scope of what humanity had built, and the more she learned, the more she wished she had not started looking. The fleet at the Spire was enormous. 3,000 warships was a force that most conclave species would struggle to match. But Sill's analysis of human industrial capacity and resource consumption and personnel deployment suggested that this was not humanity's full military. It was not even close. Her best estimates suggested that humanity had been building in secret for over a century, and that the fleet surrounding the Valith was perhaps a third of their total naval strength, and possibly less, because every time she thought she had found the bottom of the well, she found another layer beneath it. But what disturbed her more than the ships was the question of why. She had studied hundreds of species in her career, and military buildups of this scale were almost always driven by aggressive intent. Empires built fleets like this because they wanted to conquer, because they wanted to dominate, because they wanted to take what others had. But humanity had not used this fleet. They had not expanded aggressively. They had not threatened their neighbors. They had not demanded tribute or vassalage or submission from anyone. They had built the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and then they had hidden it and hoped they would never have to use it. Sill pulled up human historical records, and she read about the wars and the genocides and the nuclear arsenals and the centuries of bloodshed, and she began to understand something that the rest of the galaxy had missed. Humans did not build weapons because they wanted to fight. They built weapons because they were terrified of what happened when they could not. Their entire military doctrine was not aggression, it was fear. The deep, ancient fear of a species that had almost destroyed itself and had come out the other side with a single lesson burned into its collective soul. Never be caught unprepared, never be caught weak, never again. They had looked out at the galaxy, and they had seen a universe full of species that were older and stronger, and they had smiled and extended their hands in friendship, and they had meant it completely. And at the same time, they had been quietly and methodically building the means to survive anything that friendship could not prevent. And there was something else. Sill dug into the galactic economic data, and what she found there was almost as alarming as the fleet. Human-manufactured medical technology was in use in hospitals on over 100 worlds because it was cheap and reliable and often better than what those worlds could produce themselves. Human engineers maintained critical power infrastructure for a dozen species. Human freight lines carried goods through entire sectors of the galaxy and had become so integrated into trade networks that removing them would be like pulling a thread from the center of a tapestry. She ran the projections 3 times because she did not believe them the first 2. If the conclave sanctioned humanity economically, the resulting disruption would trigger recessions on 30 worlds, and supply chain failures across 4 sectors, and medical shortages that would cost lives on planets that had never even heard of the Terran boundary dispute. Humanity had not just come armed with warships. They had woven themselves into the fabric of the galactic economy so thoroughly that cutting them out would mean cutting into your own flesh. Sill sat back and stared at her screens and said quietly to herself, "They planned for everything." Inside the olive branch, Rael Vasquez was not planning. She was sitting in her quarters with her head in her hands, and she was tired in a way that went all the way down to her bones. David brought her coffee and sat across from her, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then Rael said, "I never wanted this." And David said, "I know." She looked up at him and said, "Do you know what they call this plan?" And David said, "Loud whisper." And Rael said, 60 years. They have been maintaining this contingency for 60 years. And every ambassador who has served since it was created has carried the knowledge that this fleet was out there hidden in the dark. And every single one of them prayed they would never have to be the one to reveal it. She said, "I was supposed to be better than this. I was supposed to find the words that made the guns unnecessary." And David said, "You did find the words. They just were not enough." Closed her eyes because she knew he was right. Word began to filter through the station that the human fleet was real, and the response was not what Zareth had expected. Instead of rallying against humanity, the conclave species began to fracture. The Nathari sent a private message to Rael, proposing a trade alliance, and it was not a gesture of friendship, but of pragmatism, because the Nathari had always been survivors, and they could see which way the wind was blowing. The Dravasi, a reptilian warrior species who respected strength above all else, sent a single transmission to the olive branch that contained one word: respect. Even some Valith subhives began to break from Zareth, sending quiet communications to their home systems, expressing doubt about the hive commander's strategy, because the math had not changed, and the math said that a fight here would end with the Valith fleet destroyed. Zareth found himself increasingly alone. His allies were peeling away, and his own commanders were questioning his judgment, and the conclave that he had expected to support him was fracturing into a dozen competing interests, none of which involved dying for his pride. And so Zareth did the only thing that a proud and cornered and desperate commander could do. He doubled down. He returned to his flagship, and he ordered his fleet to power weapons and advance on the human line, because he believed that the humans were bluffing, that no species that talked so much about peace would actually pull the trigger, that the fleet was a show, and the guns were empty, and the whole thing was a performance designed to frighten him into concessions. His subcommanders hesitated, and he screamed at them until they obeyed, and 400 Valith warships began to move forward with their weapons hot and their drone bays open, and the distance between the two fleets began to shrink. On every human ship in the fleet, targeting systems locked on, and 10,000 alarms shrieked across Valith bridges, as every single human weapon trained itself on a Valith hull, with the calm mechanical precision of a species that had been building things designed to kill for longer than it had been building anything else. And then, across every frequency, in every language, a single voice cut through the noise, and it was Rael, and she was not shouting, and she was not threatening, and there was something in her voice that sounded like it might break. She said, "Hive Commander, we do not want to fire. Please do not make us fire. There is still a chair at the table for you." The galaxy held its breath, and the distance between the fleets continued to shrink. What peace costs. For 17 minutes no one moved, and no one spoke, and the only sounds in the galaxy that mattered were the hum of charged weapons and the slow, steady beeping of targeting systems that had locked onto their marks and were waiting for a command that would end everything. 17 minutes is not a long time, unless you are standing on the bridge of a warship, watching the distance counter tick down towards zero. And then it is the longest time there has ever been. On the bridges of the Valith fleet, the hive soldiers stood at their stations, and they were connected to each other, the way all Valith were connected, through pheromones and subtle vibrations and a shared chemical awareness that linked every member of a hive into a single trembling network of feeling. And what that network was feeling now was death, not the abstract concept of death that you discuss in philosophy or read about in histories, but the immediate physical certainty of it. The knowledge that the ships around them had enough firepower to reduce the entire Valith fleet to expanding clouds of debris in less time than it would take to finish a sentence. The soldiers felt it in their chitin and their joints, and the deep places where instinct lived beneath thought, and the feeling was so overwhelming that several hive soldiers on the forward ships simply stopped responding to commands, because their bodies would not let them walk toward annihilation, no matter what their hive commander ordered. On the flagship, Zareth stood at the center of his bridge, and he could feel it too. The network screaming at him that this was wrong, that the swarm did not fly into fire it could not survive, that survival was the first law of the hive, and everything else was secondary. But Zareth was proud, and pride is a kind of deafness that blocks out every sound except the one that tells you that you cannot back down. His sub-commander Alara stood 3 paces behind him, and she was watching him the way a surgeon watches a patient. And she had been watching him for 3 days now, and she had seen the progression from confidence to frustration to rage to something that looked very much like a commander who had lost his grip on the situation and was holding on with nothing but his claws. She looked at the tactical display, and she saw 10,000 human weapons locked on the fleet, and she looked at her own weapon readouts, and she saw 400 ships that could not fire fast enough to survive the first volley, and she made a decision that she knew would end her career and possibly her life. She turned to the bridge crew, and she said, "Stand down weapons," and her voice was calm and clear, and carried the authority of someone who had served the Hive for longer than Zareth had been alive. Zareth spun toward her, and his mandibles spread wide, and he said, "You do not have the authority." And Ilara said, "Under Hive Protocol 7, I am assuming tactical command on the grounds that the current commander is pursuing a course of action that will result in the destruction of the fleet. And I am invoking the survival imperative, which outranks all other directives, including yours." Zareth lunged at her, and 2 bridge officers caught him and held him, and he thrashed and screamed. But the pheromone network was already shifting, because the Hive had heard Ilara's words, and the Hive agreed. Survival was the first law, and Zareth was leading them to extinction. Across the Valeth fleet, weapons began to power down one ship at a time, like candles being blown out in a long, dark hallway. And the targeting alarms on the human ships went silent one by one. Ilara opened a channel to the Olive Branch, and she said, "This is Subcommander Ilara of the Valeth Dominion, requesting an immediate ceasefire and the resumption of negotiations." On the bridge of the Olive Branch, Rael heard the transmission, and she closed her eyes, and for a moment she could not speak, because the relief was so enormous that it felt like a physical weight being lifted off her chest. And she had to put one hand on the console to steady herself. David was beside her, and his face showed nothing, but his hands were shaking, and that was how Rael knew how close it had been, because David's hands never shook. She opened the channel and said, "Ceasefire accepted. The chair is still there, Subcommander." Across the Accord Spire a sound rose that was hard to describe. It was the sound of 100 species exhaling at the same time. The sound of a galaxy that had just watched itself walk to the edge of a cliff and step back. Over the next 2 days, something happened that had not happened in the Conclave in a very long time. A real negotiation between parties that treated each other as equals. Rael and Ilara sat across from each other at the same table where the original terms had been read like a verdict. They talked, and they argued, and they compromised. And it was messy, and imperfect, and frustrating in the way that all honest negotiations are, because neither side got everything it wanted, and both sides had to give up things they cared about. Humanity kept its 12 colony systems, and the Valeth received trade concessions and shared access to 3 resource-rich moons. And both sides signed a mutual non-aggression pact that included provisions for joint scientific research and economic cooperation, and a framework for resolving future disputes that did not involve fleets. It was not a perfect agreement. Rael knew that, and Ilara knew that, and everyone in the room knew that. But it was real in a way that the original terms had never been, because it had been built by 2 sides that understood each other, and understood what the alternative looked like. On the final evening, before the delegations departed, Arbiter Tolsharan requested a private meeting with Rael, and she agreed, and they sat together in a small room off the main chamber. And the Arbiter's crystalline body was dim, and his voice was quiet. He asked, "How long have your ships been out there?" Rael said, "Since the day we received your invitation to the talks." The Arbiter was silent for a moment, and then he said, "You hoped for peace." Rael said, "We always hope for peace, but hoping is not the same as assuming, and we have learned the hard way that the universe does not reward assumptions." The Arbiter looked at her and said, "We underestimated you." And Rael said, "Yes," and there was no pride in the way she said it, only a kind of weariness that came from knowing that being underestimated was a gift you could only use once. Syl published her intelligence brief 3 days after the delegations departed, and it was classified at the highest level, which meant that it was leaked within 6 hours and spread across the galaxy within a day. Read document in Conclave history. The brief was thorough and precise and devastating in the way that only the truth can be, and its conclusion read, "Humanity did not deceive us. We simply never thought to look. They told us who they were from the beginning, a species forged in conflict, desperate for peace, but ready for war. We chose to see only the desperation, and that was our error." The galaxy read those words, and for the first time, it looked at the small young species on the edge of known space, and saw something it had never bothered to see before. Not a threat. Humanity had proven that it did not want to threaten anyone. Not a power to be feared, though it was certainly that. But a species that understood something the ancient civilizations of the Conclave had forgotten, that peace was not the absence of weapons, but the choice not to use them, and that the choice only meant something if you had the weapons in the first place. Branch now openly wearing its true face as a command battleship. Rails stood at the viewport and watched the Accord spire recede into the distance, and the stars stretched out before her, vast and cold and beautiful. David stood beside her, and he said nothing for a long time, because David never spoke when silence would do. Then Rail said, "Do you think it will hold?" And she meant the peace and the treaty and the fragile new understanding between humanity and a galaxy that had only just begun to see them clearly. David thought about it, and then he said, "It will hold, as long as they remember what they saw today." Rail looked out at the stars, where somewhere in the black, the human fleet was already disappearing, folding back into the shadows and the silence, becoming once again the invisible thing that no one could see and no one suspected, and no one would think about until the next time someone made the mistake of confusing kindness for weakness. Then let us hope they have long memories. The olive branch turned toward home, and its engines lit up the dark, and behind it, the Accord spire hung in the glow of the pulsar, like a lantern in an empty field. And across the galaxy, in corridors and chambers and meeting rooms on 1,000 worlds, the species of the Conclave talked about what had happened, and they told the story to each other, and to their children, and to anyone who would listen. The story of the young species that came to the peace talks with gifts and smiles and handshakes and children's drawings, and a hidden fleet large enough to crack the sky. And the lesson they took from it was simple, and it was old. And it was the same lesson that humanity had learned long ago on a blue world orbiting an ordinary star. The ones who want peace the most are the ones you should be most careful about pushing into war, because they know exactly what it costs, and they have already decided what they are willing to pay. And humanity went home, and it put its warships back in the dark, and it went back to building hospitals and trade routes and schools, and it kept reaching out its hand in friendship to every species it met. But it never stopped building, and the galaxy never forgot.